Okay, I think we can start. Good morning. This is our panel on, what is it? A panel on executive leadership before, during, and after crisis. This is the first panel that is not going to be dominated by theories, concepts, reconceptualizations, reinterpretations, at least not at the start. We don't know where it's going to go. So let me introduce the panelists, and we have a very, very distinguished panel today, and I'm super proud that we brought these people together. And I'm going to start with Bussemaker, now a colleague at Leiden University, a professor policy science and societal impact, in particular in healthcare at the Leiden University Medical Center, and the Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs, so interdisciplinary position. That is, with all respect, not why we invited you. We invited you because you're a former practitioner, a former minister, the Minister of Education, Culture and Science for a long time, 2012 to 2017, and before that, of course, a very experienced politician in many roles. So we're delighted to have you with us. Welcome. Then we have in Massachusetts Jane Swift, and again, this is wonderful to have you with us. Jane was a lieutenant governor, the youngest female lieutenant governor, and then became the youngest female governor of the great state of Massachusetts, and was the governor in charge of the response to 9/11 then in Massachusetts, and that's where one of the flights, or at least one of the flights, originated. But two of the flights originated. So speaking of not just crisis but tragedy. So we're just it's just wonderful to have you with us and pick your brains and have you so long, 20 years down the road, have you reflect on those moments, which I'm sure are it seems like yesterday. But anyway, we're going to ask you that. What can I assume? Then we have with us. I still say Professor Uri Rosenthal, and that is because he was my professor. My promoter in Dutch, my advisor in English. So that also means, even though we invited Uri as a former minister, and we had him yesterday, made a cameo appearance in another panel, the former minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, and many other political roles, also in the Netherlands. But before all that, he was a professor of public administration, one of the founding professors of public administration in Leiden, but much more important, one of the first professors of public administration in the world who started paying to crisis. And so he's really one of the crisis pioneers. And so we owe him a lot. He's published a lot, and so it's just really wonderful to make that full circle, have you come back and be able to reflect from both sides of the aisle. So welcome. And then we have we three politicians, and then we have somebody who represents the class of people who serve politicians. Frederick Bynander. So he knows the stories too. He's been raised by somebody academically raised, Bengt Sundelius in Sweden. Somebody's also one of the pioneers in crisis management in international relations. And Frederick is now the director of the Center for Societal Security, which is used to be called Krijgsmarkt for those who've been around. But we didn't invite him for that. We invited him because he was a special advisor to the Swedish government's Secretariat for Crisis Coordination for a couple of years, and thus served those people making decisions in crisis, in the preparatory phase, during crisis, after crisis, and of course still does a lot of consultancy with those same people, and So we have together, welcome Frederick, a super rich panel here reflecting on what does it mean to be a leader. You know, before a crisis, because in creeping crisis, you know, there's also a before, during a crisis, after a crisis, and there are some notes here, but we're just gonna go to the people and ask them to have some introductory remarks, and then we're gonna kick off the discussion. We'll see where this leads. This will be totally different than our other panels, and I would like, would you like to start off, or would you like others to start off? It's your prerogative.
Doesn't make any difference for me. If you want me to start, that's fine. You know, talking about leadership on before and during and after a crisis, I would say it's very important to be prepared for a crisis, but you never know what crisis it will be. And that's so important that you learn to cope with unexpected events. And what I see nowadays is that we have a lot of talk of pandemic preparedness, and that what I see that a lot of organizations are thinking about being prepared for the next kind of COVID crisis. But I think, based upon my experience as a former Minister of Education, I also was a State Secretary of Healthcare for 3 years, so I also experienced a lot of healthcare problems. It always comes unexpected. So we may now prepare for a pandemic preparedness, COVID-19 kind of thing, but the next crisis might be very, very different. So that brings me to the point that to be prepared does not ask for specific institutions or specific regulations, but much more on an adaptive way to deal with unexpected events. And that is asking for different kind of organization, different kind of attitudes, also different kind of culture. And that also brings me to the point of acting during a crisis. I had to think about, you know, also I recently wrote a book about my time in politics, and one of the aspects I was thinking about, I was in a cabinet as a minister for the Labour Party during a tough economic time, and we took firmly our responsibilities. But then we lost the contact with our electorate, and we did very bad in the next elections. So in terms of Peter Mayer, we did very good in taking responsibility, but we did not very good in representation. Thinking about crisis, I had to think maybe there's another balance we have to find, to take the responsibility and to take it firmly and directly, because you are the leader and you have to show that you can act. And at the same time, to be responsive. And I think that is often forgotten during a crisis, because you have to act and everyone is looking to you. You have to do something. And as a politician, in such a situation, it's often more important to take a decision than that it will be the best decision, because you don't have time to deliberate about all the pros and cons, so you simply have to. So you know that you will make faults anyhow. And therefore I think it is important to be transparent to the general public and also to be responsive to other opinions, to opposition, and you may create opposition also internally. And also to take time for reflection, because when you are acting, you sometimes forgot that the bigger picture. What I often see, and I've done it myself as well during a crisis, that you are so focused, and you have to be focused on very detailed measures, that it is sometimes very important to take a step back And especially when you are in a government and you have to deal with other ministers and you are in a ministerial council, it might be very easy to focus on what you internally agree upon and focus on these issues. And you just go forward, and you might forget, or you might ridicularize what the opponents outside the government may think. Or you do not really listen anymore to other opinions. So I would say in a crisis and after a crisis, it is very, very important not only to take the responsibility and to show your leadership, but also in a way to be responsive to others. And what I see in the Netherlands, for example, the discussion with vaccine deniers, or people who are not vaccinated yet, a small group of people will never get vaccinated, so you will never convince them. But others might become, might accept finally a vaccination, but not if they have the feeling that the government is not responsive to their ideas. And that's a very difficult situation, because for Parliament, you have to show that you are firm, you have to show boldness. So at the same time, you should show humbleness, so to say, to others. So just as a kickoff. There's much more to say about it.
Well, that is a very rich kickoff, and I'm struck that Peter Mears distinction. We talked about it this morning.
I didn't know that.
Oh, you did not know that? Well, that is coincidental then, or maybe not. But it's one thing that academics talk about, all these tensions, and but to hear that people realize, or experience, I should say, experience that tension between doing the right thing, but the right thing in terms of effectiveness, and doing the right thing in terms of legitimacy, what the people expect of you. And of course, what people expect of you may not be the right thing in terms of effectiveness, and the other way around. And that this must be the sort of endless, unresolvable almost, maybe it is resolvable, but position.
No, I don't think it's resolvable in a way that there's one solution. It's more something I think we have to get used to more as an attitude. And it's not solvable, but I ask attention also for the issue that during a crisis, it's very easy to focus yourself on micromanagement. And anyway, you have to, because details matter. It might be a matter of death or life, the details. And at the same time, you have to make a step back, to look to the bigger picture. And that's very difficult. That's a very difficult aspect of leadership. And you can't do it alone. So the question is, what can you arrange around you for instance, by organizing your internal opposition? And I don't think that the Dutch government did very well in organizing that, but I have seen a couple of mayors who did quite well in organizing it, and having a real dialogue with also opponents of the governmental or local policies. So there are different ways to deal with the issue, but I think it's a tension we simply have to accept there is. So
well,
we cannot solve the tension.
It's good to acknowledge the tension. That's to begin with that. I also like the, and then I'm going to pass it on because I can feel we can already fill that hour and a half, I'm sure, yet. But I do want to just underline that you remarked of the importance of being humble, and because this comes to the personal domain, and Uri writes about that in his books also, as the personal part of this. And so I want to just bookmark that, because I want to get back to that. Really, all three of you, and then we can hear the experience of how that is experienced maybe on the other side, and we'll see where that goes. We're going to Massachusetts. They always say there are cultural differences and leadership has done this and that. Do you recognize any of this, Jane?
So I found that fascinating. I think the setup of technical versus adaptive decision making and the predisposition of political leaders in a crisis to go to the technical changes as opposed to the adaptive changes, which have more of a long-term runway, is something that clearly carries. I have thought about crisis today as well as in comparison to when I led. I think it's harder today. And as I said the other day, I think there are three large factors impacting society and certainly political leadership. The velocity of change in society. So our world with technology and advances in science changes so quickly, but governments largely are designed to be methodical, thoughtful, and to govern more slowly, except in a crisis. And so how you deal with this collision of the velocity of change, I think is something that I heard coming through as well in the minister's discussion. Also, the volume of information, which I believe is related to her description of who you get information from in order to build consensus. It's both people who agree with you and disagree with you. And I wrote down her ideas about engaging the opposition, but also sorting through who is providing the information and sometimes their motivation to distort information. And then this distrust of elites that I know we have significantly in the United States and I believe exists in other parts of the world. So I think when it comes to before, during, and after these issues, as she so correctly said, and I'm sure others will say, you do not know what crisis will befall you. And so the before is really about who you put in that internal circle. And I heard a lot of discussion about you need people who are loyal to you, and every appointment of subject matter experts in government, you're balancing so many priorities, and you don't know if your secretary, in our case, instead of minister, but of health, will be the most important to deal with a crisis. Or in my case, the National Guard and public safety had no idea would have to deal with the magnitude of the problem. So you're making those appointments to your inner circle of direct folks to advise you without that knowledge. And I think how you balance having subject matter expertise with all the other things you must consider in appointments turns out to be incredibly important when the crisis occurs. During the crisis, I know we'll have a rich discussion, Professor Boyne, about how you make information, and that's really that technical and adaptive. It's very, very hard for leaders to make long-term decisions. The other thing I would say with this sort of velocity of change, these creeping crises, I worry a lot about the sustainability of our public leaders. When I was governor on 9/11, George Bush spoke about this sort of fog of decision-making where you're inside the bubble getting all of the worst information, and that impacts you both from your own health, but also your ability to make good decisions. And I don't think we pay enough attention in these long duration crises to that issue. And then afterwards, this whole learning the lessons and what's the role, I think I've read a lot about the role of elites during the crisis in advising, but as we discussed on Wednesday, the role of elites in what the minister just discussed, right? Trying to set up these systems and structures to give better information. I'm fascinated to listen this morning and just so honored that you included me. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Jane. Also, thank you for bringing up the issue of the sustainability of public leadership, as you put it, and increasingly and finally, I should probably note, and I know we will have something to say about this. We're putting the public, not the public, I'm sorry, the health of the public decision makers, the politician on the agenda, and this really deserves attention. But I'll leave that to Uri to also say something about that. And of course, the whole idea of that volume of information also is very interesting, because that brings us back to the who is doing the sorting for you, and how much sorting do you want to know how it is sorted, and we had the notion of boundary rationality this morning, which I thought was interesting, because it finally came to me like, okay, this is what it means in practice. It's not just theoretical. It's and maybe there may be even a desire, if you're in a situation like that, to simplify matters. It just which is logical if you got to make. But I'm presuming I know something. I'm going to ask you about that. First, we're going to switch to Uri. Please share your thoughts with us.
Okay, thank you, Arjen. And let me beforehand actually take a half minute to say that during the previous days I learned a lot here about what is going on, how to look at the things at hand. And let me say that I wrote a note for this conference, and I actually was happy, for instance, to hear yesterday the identification, especially also by Paul Hart, of what we are actually up to in, for instance, a COVID-19 crisis, but also in other so-called creeping crises. And that is this duality. He calls it a dual crisis. And let me say that when we got this COVID-19 here in this country, I wrote a memo to one of our political leaders. I will not mention who. And I wrote to him that we were actually confronting, I called it then, the worst imaginable type of crisis. A mix of protracted crisis with an open end, if an end at all, and on the other hand, the potential recurrence of hectic episodes, of sheer immediate calls for action, for critical decisions, often even irreversible, although you know that there is so much coming later on. Partly foreseeable, like in the COVID-19 crisis, we got our second wave, our third wave, and what have you, and what have we in the offing. Partly totally, or to some extent, totally unscheduled events. And this notion of dual crisis is indeed something which is, in any case, creeping up in my mind. Now, the interesting thing is that this political leader, when I talk about what is going on, I'm always using also this notion of crisis of exhaustion, in which the political leaders at hand, and I see Jane confirming it on the screen, these leaders are being confronted, are facing actually a very treacherous kind of stress, which is not acute stress, but it is chronic stress. And sooner or later, they will see their concentration, their powers of concentration, their physical and mental health being in a quite problematic phase, which in this country, by the way, showed itself by the burnout, actually, physically, mentally, of 3 full-fledged cabinet ministers and very many people in the House of Commons. Now, when I sometimes talk to this political leader about all this, the interesting thing is that the direct focus will, whether you like it or not, be in his mental mind on the next day, the next week, the acute form of this type of stress and crisis, while he is clever enough to understand that he is in a long, protracted process with recurrent, unscheduled events. Now, this having been said, let me pick up a few points, and I actually, in this way, rework a little bit the notes I wrote for this conference, and I pick up a few things. First, yes, political and other leaders should prepare relentlessly for their role in crisis situations, but they should be very open-minded and open-ended in this sort of preparation. And they should indeed very understand how easily they may fall victim to what is called false analogies, fighting the last war once more. I'm in strong favor of building up, for that reason too, the early warning capacities of, for instance, our nation, which is now rather sector divided, but I think we need comprehensive early warning capacities to be upgraded. Another point which I pick up from my notes is, and it was already mentioned by Jet, that during whatever situation you may have, even during the most hectic episodes, executive leaders should understand that they have to reflect before they act. And the Arjen will say, oh, here is going again. It is the famous 30-second rule, maxim, which says that when people are in a hectic situation, in a hectic situation room, you might ask them to shut up for 30 seconds. And there will be some embarrassment during these 30 seconds.
And just to tell you, this used to be a 1-minute exercise, but at least he shortened it.
Okay. But it shows how important it may be to reflect before you act. And you can learn a lot of things during these 30 seconds. And you may even be able to redefine the situation, although the situation is already closing down to a sort of tunnel vision. A last point which I would like to raise as an opening statement is, I wrote it down, that political leaders should be, of course, fully aware of the fact, overwork today, over-research, that crises are fertile ground for groupthink. We all know that. And they should be willing, but at the same time, what is very important for political executive leaders at large is their capacity to identify and probe into the significant details of what is going on. That is what political assessment and political intuition is about, to pick up the significant details. And in order not to only talk about others, let me tell you that I, as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, got into a sort of hectic moment during the Libya situation, the fall of Gaddafi. We had to evacuate them. I say, don't take it mistakenly, totally different from what is now going on with Afghanistan. But after all, we had to evacuate 300 people from Libya, from that huge territory. And we were able to do it in a very effective way, by the way, without support from the EU. We had to do it on our own. And after all, one guy was left behind there in Libya. So we did a failed evacuation mission by helicopter, which was caught by the Gaddafi gang. And I vividly remember that when I was asked to give my go decision, apart from our Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, and the Minister of Justice, I simply forgot to ask. I asked 4 questions, and I forgot one very seemingly small question. Did you got the assessment from both intelligence services, both the IVD, the General Intelligence Service, and the Military Intelligence Service? And I got the answer, we don't know for sure whether that is already in. And it was a matter of hours. And I didn't get into the real significant details of that question. And I think that if I would have got the answer, which was no, after all, we didn't get these intelligence reports, then I would definitely have said no go. So significant details are really sometimes matters of what is the whole situation is up to. Last but not least, if I may say so a little bit arrogantly, last but not least, if political leadership has a distinctive quality, it is about communicating critical decisions and the picture at large to the public at large. It has already been mentioned. A pet remark on my part is always that it is up to the public and political leadership to channel the collective stress in society. I heard about moral panic here in the previous session. And thirdly, it is about taking responsibility for the success and failure of handling the crisis. And where do the political leaders have to take responsibility? First and foremost, towards Parliament. And in a just published book, which I wrote, I write 1 chapter about democracy and crisis. And there you see the inherent tension between, on the one hand, the need for the capacity to govern on the part of the government, of the political leadership, and on the other hand, the need for democratic control and democratic accountability on the part of the powers that be. We have had decades in which there was a clear sequence to this equation. The government governs, and subsequently, later on, Parliament looks at what has been done. Today, crises, and surely also creeping crises, are politicized to a high extent, and Parliament will not be willing and able to leave the government the room for maneuvering which they used to have in previous times. So the burden of decision-making for the leaders of a country are only on the increase instead of being on a level of, let me say, on a moderate level, which they used to be in previous decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Uri. Well, there's many of the issues raised are familiar to me because this is what we've been talking about over the years. But it's fantastic to have that summarized in a few minutes. And I think I'll go back to you. What I appreciate is the sort of going back to these key moments. Because in the end, when we talk about crisis, we still go back to key moments, the key moments of decision making, and the importance of details, and significant details. But obviously, what is a significant? And who determines what is significant? Well, this is the art, right? This is the was mentioned political intuition, the intuition of the politician versus the knowledge of the expert, so to say. And what an interesting tension that can be.
actually insert one point on this. It
Yeah,
is
he's-
about
he's my
this-
professor.
Sorry.
Briefly now.
Yeah, it's about these experts.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm going to talk to one here
Yes,
soon.
we need expert advice. Okay. Now, what I see increasingly are two problems. Is actually the following problem: that expert advice easily starts to become the advice of institutionalized inside circles, not listening enough to experts from the outside. That's one. And secondly, and Jane will remember it, after 9/11, there was a strong feeling in the US at least, that with that sort of unimaginable and inconceivable crisis, you might need a totally different kind of advice, namely scenario writing by Hollywood kind of creative minds. And I sometimes lack this notion of creative advice to reflexive practitioners.
Okay. This brings us to the lack of imagination that Bengt always likes to talk about. So, details, what are the details, and experts and institutionalized inside circles that, well, I think he's talking about you, Frederick, because you ran one of those institutions, and so I'd be, very interested to hear your perspective now, hearing about, and you know this, what politicians need or think they need, and the challenges that you then have in dealing with and serving, because there's both sides of the dimension, or both dimensions of this job, politicians, especially when they're stressed and very eager to get those significant details.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to try and pop the hood a little bit about what goes on in government offices below the political level. And just a disclaimer, what happened to me a year and a half ago was that I was sitting there in my university office shutting down everything because, hey, we had restrictions, right? Even in Sweden, so we weren't going to teach anybody in our classrooms. And my old boss from the government offices called me and said, hey, we need some reinforcements here. This is getting pretty ugly. This is early March 2020. And so, yeah, I can come in a week or two. And he says, no, I need you here in an hour. And you're in for a job interview with our state secretary, and tomorrow morning you start. So that's basically what happened. I brought 7 people with me, and we spent 6 months doing COVID response. And it was nothing like I saw a few years previously when being in a crisis coordination center was about getting the attention of politicians. We had it now. That was not a problem anymore. On the other hand, a lot of other things happened. The bureaucratic infighting that happened beneath the hood that I was talking about was quite aggressive, I would say, because COVID response is not only about disease control and the health sector, it's about a lot of things. And everybody wants a piece of, for example, all the big packages that was being handed out as part of, saving the economy as a result of this. So there was a lot of moving parts when you walk into a government office in crisis. Let me just, because I know the Swedish strategy is on, we've been talking about it throughout this conference, and I'm not going to review it, but maybe one of the explanations why we ended up looking like very laissez-faire was that, during the HIV pandemic, we had a traditional CDC type agency in Sweden, and they were tough. And they shut down, like we had sauna clubs, so the gay community hated these people. These are the undertakers of civil rights and democracy. And then we had like a 4 or 5 years reform period where this agency was shut down. We can't be doing this. to our citizens, so we're going to create something new, a public health agency that also does disease control, but has the mandate to look through public health in general. And I think that's a big explanation to how the Swedish strategy looked and the response looked the way it did, because we need to take into account all these different things, and it's not just about locking down our society. And it was clear inside the government offices that we cannot throw out the baby with the bathwater here. We do think that leaning on trust in society is a good strategy of trying to do the same things that the Italians and country after country is trying to do. We can do it without force, so to speak. And the government is still clinging to this. We'll see. The other thing, if you want to explain the Swedish strategy, is the economic issues was very vivid from day one, and I think more than in most countries. I do think we all have our historical traumas. And in Sweden, that would be financial crises. And people are a little bit, there's a big fear to end up where we were in the early 2000s. And so this was, I think, a bigger part of crisis response than in most countries. And now I get to sort of the interiors that I promised I would offer. So I was head of an analysis group, and we had representatives from most ministries, and we were able to draw upon different types of scientific and expert communities. So it sounded great, right? Only thing is, there were some conclusions that weren't allowed. And this is not spoken out loud. You don't say, you can't say this. But the ministerial representatives, they know what won't fly with their ministry. And in Sweden, the system is that everybody has to undersign this before it goes to the political level. And it takes forever, and we didn't have forever, at this point. So we started cutting corners. And, the bureaucratic high priest hated it. And we went behind their back sometimes because we had to get something on the table for the politicians to decide upon. But it created all kinds of tensions. We were big on tensions in this conference, and they were definitely there. And I would say one thing that may be particular for Sweden was that we had an overcoat in this analysis group, and that was the overcoat from the Ministry of Finance, because that was the person that had to sign off on anything. Because one of the reasons why we couldn't come to certain conclusions was that they would cost money, right? And so the Ministry of Finance person would say, this is a legitimate COVID-19 response thing, and that can cost money. This, on the other hand, is a way to buffer the budget of this ministry, and we're not going to do it. And so we had an umpire present in all discussions, and that's an interesting thing. And I think that's part of bureaucratic politics that we need to understand when we think about where does expertise come from, and how neutral and our recommendations and so forth. So I'm running out of time, and I'm just going to go into one of the problems that I felt was very acute. So when you're dealing with this, you have an analysis group, all angles of the problem, right? Well, fusing knowledge, as we all know, is highly difficult. It comes with all kinds of complexities, and the more angles that you pull into the room, the harder it gets. So, and we all know that we need to simplify, not because politicians are stupid, but because we can't deal with all this complexity at one time. We need to arrive at a few options. This is usually what these bureaucracies do. They, package things. So we could either do this, and then we get this problem, or we could do that, and then we get this other problem, right? But the thing is, when the uncertainty is as dense as during the early days of COVID-19, this becomes like you're playing shop in a way. You don't know these things. So packaging becomes a very, weird way of trying to explain what is going on. So this situational image that we talked about, situational awareness, you can't use those tools because you basically have to first paint a picture of what we think we're up against and what we think might be successful measures in at least, starting to chip away at the problem. And that's really hard for the bureaucracies that are so used to, getting actionable options on the table for the politicians to decide upon. So there's a mismatch here with what you're trained to do and we can actually do in a situation like that. And I don't think we did a bang-up job, to be honest. And I do think that now that we see all the accountability processes, some of the criticism is squarely directed at that process that didn't work well enough. Let me just end with one last thing, and this is also something that has been talked about. So many would say that the Swedish government was taken hostage by one agency and really one guy who was on TV every day. His name is Anders Tegnell. He became the most famous guy in Sweden. And I would say there's some truth to that, but it was a choice early on to say that, we're going to back our experts. They're the people who know how to tackle this. And it was maybe a naive choice because there are so many other aspects to dealing with a pandemic than just, dealing with the disease control. But in other ways, it was a smart choice because then you got to do the more longer term issues, behind the scenes, so to speak. So that guy caught all the flack where you could sit and think about how do we save the economy, how do we do all these other things. And I think the problem here is they weren't very open about sort of the division of labor, and they weren't very open about what is the situation where we step in and change the strategic course. And since they didn't talk about it, they couldn't do it. So I'm going to end there.
Well, thank you for this insightful, and especially in a very recent experience, very relevant. And it's reminding of the whole thesis of bureau politics and politism. So what we have now, we have some very interesting openings, very rich opening statements. We can take it many ways. I have, selective few things. I want to know many things, but I don't want to hoard time. So I'm gonna, I don't know if there are gonna be any comments and questions. I'm gonna open it up. Meanwhile, if nobody does that, and then all the better for me, because then I get to ask the questions. So so I'll just start, and if I keep talking, that's don't worry, my list is long. So I want to, Jane, I want to come back to you for a second, and then the others can see if they want to chime into this. But you went to this momentous, literally, event, 9/11, that has really defined how we think about history almost, or recent history, as a marking point. And we're talking about all these, and I think we're all agreeing that, you want to know many things. There's uncertainty, there's stress, and you got to make decisions. And but in that moment of time, and it's almost like a sports question, you make that last second shot, and how did it feel? But it really is interesting to hear. So how do you look back at those first minutes almost of that first hour of what is going on here, that question, and I have to make decisions, as was pointed out, and what does that do to a policy? Because we can talk all day about effectiveness versus responsiveness, and it's fantastic, but this is really what's being in the hot seat. You have to do it. You don't have the information. One of Uri's colleagues, Dror used to talk about fuzzy gambling. I don't even know if it's fuzzy, but certainly a lot of gambling seems to be involved, or not. How do you reflect on this, Jane?
So two things your other panelists said actually resonated with me in how that morning played out. So my family and I lived 3 hours in normal travel time from the state capitol. So I'm very struck by your professor's activity of taking 30 seconds or a minute of silence, because it's hard to imagine, but 20 years ago, our technology for communication, when someone is, in my case, moving very quickly with a police escort to Boston, where all the decisions in the press needed to be, and it took, about 2 hours. I was somewhat insulated from information which I saw as a deficit in that moment. So I could hear what was playing out on the radio. A few times my husband was able to call me, but most of our signals had shut down, so there was no cell phone or mobile communication. But, and I've reflected to other folks that I felt so out of my depth because public safety certainly was not an area of strength for me or a focus. And terrorism was something I had spent no time as a political official, some minor time as an individual speaking or thinking about. And I've told folks that it was the one time in my life I sort of prayed quietly. And I'm just struck by perhaps my ability to make good decisions, which the public was always critical of how far away I lived, may have been enhanced by my ability to actually process and think. And it was a barrier that existed. So that's new, sort of a new lens for me that I want to process from your professor. The second thing about the decision-making and not knowing if you're right or wrong. So I had to make 2 big decisions on the day of 9/11 with limited knowledge, but very good input from professionals. One was early before the attack, we had an election going on in Boston, and deciding whether or not individuals should continue to go to voting places to keep voting was a huge decision that I sided with those who said keep the polls open. We can keep people safe. And I'm struck in the Sweden sort of strategy. So when you're right and make decisions that turn out you made with limited information, everyone applauds them. But it just as easily could have been wrong. So there were no subsequent attacks, but nobody knew that in the moment. And so a decision that has been hailed and that I made with limited information that I felt, and when I look back at some of the projections of me speaking, I'm always amazed because I felt so uncertain inside, but was somehow able to present this certainty on the outside that people must stop voting, the terrorists can't win. So, part of whether it's Sweden or other places and decisions that were made, the narrow line between if you're right or wrong is going to determine how your performance is interpreted. And to a certain degree, in the unknowable, that's not particularly fair. And I don't think our public has much appetite for political leaders making big decisions that turn out to be wrong. And so that one other thing I just wanted to note, the thing that struck me about Sweden having made decisions in an unknowing time is it's much easier to do what everyone else is doing. Because if you do what everyone else is doing, the criticism is buffered. And so understanding the context of why that decision was made and whether we agree with what the strategy is and it proves out to be right or wrong, I think it's really important to study the ways in which someone makes a decision different than everyone else, because If you do that and you're right, it will be seen as sort of a profile in courage and enormous political courage, because there's so much pressure to do the thing that everyone else is doing.
Thank you, Jane. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. You've been very, very patient, and you have many, many points to make. So I'm giving you. You can either react to Jane, but you can also pick one of your own points.
A couple of points. I really recognize what Jane just said about it's much easier during a crisis to copy others than to do it in your own way. And of course, especially with COVID-19, which was a worldwide crisis, you see, especially in Europe, you see all the countries starting from Italy and then trying to copy some of the results. And I thought that Sweden started in another way, and I think that was quite smart. And that brings me also to the point of the definition of the crisis. I think in the Netherlands and in many other countries, COVID-19 was defined from the beginning and for a very long term only in terms of medical definitions and also in terms of technical medical, as a technical medical issue. And so there became a definition, for example, of vulnerability. The definition of vulnerability was only related to the risk of getting the disease. In my opinion, and I'm also the chair of the Advisory Council of Healthcare and Society, we were quite critical about that definition because we said maybe for the first couple of weeks that's okay, but then in a long-term crisis, you also have to think about possible other definitions of vulnerability. For example, people who are vulnerable for a long-term isolation, or for people with social or psychiatric problems, if they can't go to their daily meetings, then they may become psychotic or, other severe health issues. And so to think about the kind of definition is very important. And what I liked from the Swedish proposals was that it was much more defined, not only in medical terms, but also in social and economic terms. And I think that was a little bit missing in the Netherlands, and that's what I meant, is that you also have to organize your own opponents and the way of critical thinking to avoid groupthink. And that also means that you need all the ministers to be involved in it. I think in the beginning, it's important that you have a small group of people who take the lead. That's also leadership. But leadership is also to involve all these other aspects, especially when it comes to a long-term crisis. And I agree with what Uri said, that it's a short and long-term at the same time. You have to think about long-term effects, and you have to think about all these small crises within it, the unexpected and unscheduled crisis. And that makes it very difficult to find the balance, also to find the balance in responsiveness. And another point I want to make is what this means for the way you deal with your advisors. Of course, you have to back your advisors as a politician, and you also have to trust them. But you also have to keep to your own responsibility, to keep your own role as a politician vis-à-vis the advisors. And in a Dutch situation, our Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, he was quite wise at the beginning when he said, we will travel upon the compass of science, which especially by then, after Trump, who said just science is just only an opinion, and there was a lot of criticism also in the Netherlands about institutions on healthcare. That was very wise. But at the same time, I for me, it was not always very clear whether the government took a decision because it was their political decision, balanced all the different interests and all the different perspectives, or they focused on the advice of the advisors in the Netherlands, the outbreak management team, because it was also, to say, a simple way out in the crisis, because you had to deal with it, you had to do something. And so I think it's very important also to understand the relation between advisors or scientists on the one hand, and the way politicians cope with that on the other hand. As you said, it's important that advisors, they can give the advantage and disadvantages and the pros and cons from different alternatives. But finally, politicians have to make a choice between the bad and very bad and the little positive sides of it. That's what politics is about. So you can't hide yourself behind science. Science cannot say what's good for society at large. To give one example, in the Netherlands, at a certain moment, we closed the schools, although it did not come from, and also the scientists supported it, although there was no evidence, scientific evidence, that it was necessary. And I think in Sweden, you didn't close the schools. And now today there was a report again about severe consequences for pupils about their reading their capabilities, which became much worse during the crisis. So what I want to say, there is not the right solution, so you have to deal with it. And I think, so we have to rethink also the relation between advisors, science on the one hand, politics making difficult choices, because that's what politics is for.
Well, this is, and I know you're burning, Uri, and I'm getting to you, but I want to summarize it, kind of bring it together and give it to you then. Because Jay made a very important point that you're actually, I think you're fleshing it out, and then Uri is going to say something about this. So Jane is saying, which will be the end of my conclusion, but she starts with it. It's like, it's really not fair how people assess us. So that's what Jane said. Because, you know, my decision in hindsight, which I had no idea because I had no information, and it played out well, and I was hailed for that decision, but I know it could have been totally different, and I lived on the other end of the state, and that it would have hung me just, you know, being 3 hours away from Logan or whatever, the command center. If the decision would have gone wrong. I'm interpreting this, it probably went differently, but the point there, and then what you're saying is you're really sketching out all these dimensions of tension and make it really difficult. So, you know, I have my own responsibility, but I have to listen to advisors. Okay.
But at the same time, I agree with Jane, you always will make mistakes.
Oh, yeah,
because you don't know about what's going on, and not only 9/11, not only COVID-19, but talking about crisis. I remember myself the asylum crisis in 2015, the shutdown of MH17, all kinds of the murderer of Pim Fortuyn, and in one way or another, I was involved in all these crises, but they were also very different. But in all these crises, you are missing information, well, and you had to deal.
And that is the key point. So you apparently cannot make good decisions if you don't have information. It's impossible. There's a sort of almost a philosophical point here, and it's just not possible. Which then, all those discussions about, you know, operational details versus long-term considerations, speed versus, you know, having all these people in the room that remind you that there's another side, but in the end, and the word already was presented to us earlier also, you talk about intuition, and because they're value judgments, and that's why we elect politicians, because, you know, we'll just say that's your job then to apply your intuition to this, and it's not going to be fair, because if your intuition is wrong, we'll be back to you, and then we'll use all those other arguments. in the accounting. And then I'll get back to your role, because who knows what your role then is. But if this is the case, so the essence of, that's what we're getting to, the essence of crisis decision making, and the lone role then, the lone, because it's a lone also. There's a sort of a loneliness to it then. If you're the one in the room and everybody's looking at you to make that decision. I mean, you're there, all of you, but you're making the decision. Paul Huyd said that once. He said, they're all looking at me. It's like, I now have to make that decision. Anyway, Uri, now you can grab the microphone and tell me how wrong and uninformed I am.
Well, let me get back a little bit to a more prosaic part of the story, which is striking me again and again, and that is that we are now talking talking COVID-19. But when I look at a political leader, there are other areas of concern and immediate action as well, beyond, for instance, COVID-19. A prime minister in this country has an agenda in which COVID-19 is part of the story. But he also has to cope with questions about climate and energy, Afghanistan. By the way, quite a cabinet formation. And by the way, day-to-day business, which is also within the 7 days, 24 hours. 7 days, 24 hours agenda. So that is one point which I would like to add to the story. A second point is totally different, and it's actually, I'm puzzled by it, because I see so many different ways of approaching this quite straightforward question on your part, Arjen. On the one hand, when I look at a political leader who has to take a decision, of course he's listening to experts of various kinds. On the other hand, I vividly remember a classic in my academic discipline, a very thin book by two American scholars, Cohen and Lindblom, under the title Usable Knowledge. And that is about a simple observation on their part that political leaders of course, have a variety of premises for action. Only one of them being scientific advice, expert advice, etc. But it will differ from situation to situation. As Jet already mentioned, and others have done it in previous panels again and again, and Frederick is also talking about it, when you, as our Prime Minister said, have to take decisions at a certain moment, 100% irreversible decisions, because that is what dealing with crisis is about, irreversible decisions with, he said then on television, 50% of information, but it actually boiled down to 5 or 6%. Then of course it is of the utmost importance that you have maybe only one reliable and trusted source on which you can lean. So that is that part of the story. And then it becomes a puzzle for me, and I remember also from my own experience and from experiences of colleagues in cabinet, etc., that sometimes a political leader, of course, is approached with our well-known academic style of giving him 3 scenarios to choose from, while his mental frame is actually with, tell me, for God's sake, what I have to do. at this very moment. So that is also one part of the puzzle I see, and I see various situations in which various mental states of mind are basic to what a political leader actually will do in a concrete situation. So as it is sometimes said, Arjen, I'm puzzled, but increasingly at a higher level.
I wish I could reach that state. Frederick, you must be puzzled, or not. So do you recognize this species of decision makers that you then have to serve? Because, you think in scenarios and rational and this and that, but they think in terms of politics and so it's a different mind. It's a different logic, as we didn't say. The political logic versus the a more maybe techno-rational logic. How hard is that for advisors to consider both that effectiveness part and the responsive part? The legitimate part, the politician part, if you will. How can you make them win, but also how can you make them do the right thing? From a technical, rational part, and then knowing that they're going to focus on one detail, and they have this nasty, intuition thing. Right. It might just throw everything off the table. So it makes your job really. I'm sorry to summarize. Now you can hear how they think about it. But so Frederick.
Well, you got to know your boss, right?
Well, this is maybe a very important point.
Because there are as many types of politicians as there are, parties and individuals that enter this space. And when you get a new boss, you make mistakes usually because you think that here's information that will probably make something happen because I know there needs to be a trigger, right? Some people don't need a trigger. We know this. Some politicians need to be, kept away from triggers. And this, I know this sounds manipulative, and if you are manipulative, your boss is going to see through you within hours. But there's also a sense of what kind of information makes this person function in terms of decision making. Some people, we've had the discussion about Trump. He wanted pictures, right? He didn't want text. Text was boring, took a long time. I still think that's pretty unusual for a political leader. But you need to have a sense of where is this going. And there's also the many levels problem here. So in order to get your piece of advice or your piece of information through all the different levels, first the bureaucratic ones, and then we shouldn't forget that the political level too has different sort of layers of what's going on. So first you need to talk to your state secretary, and you have a discussion, and then it gets presented to the minister. And that process can also, first of all, distort the message in that information, and second, it can sort of, because once you get together and talk about, you tend to find the lowest common denominator, so to speak, and you water out the things that the decision maker really need in order to make an informed decision. So there are all kinds of things that goes on in bureaucracies that doesn't serve leaders very well. But I do think if we turn that coin around, there are individuals in bureaucracies, especially usually pretty senior people who have been around the block for a while, who knows that we need to come back to certain messages, certain types of information for this to really stick and be a productive part of making decisions. Because one thing we know is when bureaucracies don't work, leaders watch CNN to make their decisions, and that's usually not a good thing.
Oh, that sounds threatening. Do you recognize this?
Yeah, I recognize very much what you say about, you first have to understand what kind of politician, what kind of minister you have to serve, because there are big differences. And sometimes you might have people, and I think Uri and I are examples, who want to read and want to know a lot. Others might just not be that interested in a lot of academic information. And therefore, it's very important to have this kind of senior positions, people who have been around the block, who can take the one step back position. And I think also, so in the bureaucracy, you have to find a balance between the specialist who will focus on more the micromanagement issues, and the others who will ask the question, not only are we doing the things good, but are we doing the good things during this crisis? And of course, that's lonely, I recognize that. At the same time, my experience is, I have, unfortunately, a couple of experiences with healthcare providers and schools who collapsed or almost collapsed, and it was irreversible. So it was a crisis, although we had a little bit more time, a week or 2 weeks, to try to solve the problem. That's different from a COVID-19 or 9/11. But anyhow, it forced us to, or it stimulated us to change the institutional organization within the ministry and the inspectorate and a lot of other organizations. We stopped with the traditional hierarchy, but it became a network of young and senior people from different departments to try to solve the problem. And it was still lonely, finally, to take the decision, because, you know, there is not one good decision. But it stimulated me also very much, because it was much more open, much more responsive than a traditional hierarchical system within a ministry, where you only get the final advice, which has already been cut off by all the difficult aspects or all the controversies, because they only want to give the minister one simple advice. And so it was also very good aspects to work in a crisis situation, to be much more open, to be more democratic, and also to use, to work much more in a network than in a traditional hierarchical situation. I don't know if you recognize that.
There's a lot of mutual recognition here, which is good.
You can learn a lot from never waste a good crisis. I think this is something we should do much more in the way we deal with policy making between departments and within a department in different offices. So it's also something we have to learn for the organization of the whole bureaucracy.
We are, and this is how, you know, a good discussion makes time pass very quickly. And so we have a few minutes left, and I'm going to pose a totally different question to each. Each one is getting the same. Oh, I'm not getting to my. This always happens to me when I just sort of want to round it up. Magnus wants to throw some undoubtedly philosophical question, and something international, I'm sure. No, oh no, okay. Magnus Egengren coming in from Uppsala.
Well, I have a question to the panel, which was a great panel. How can you foster good intuition? How do we foster a good crisis manager? Is it only through his or her own experiences that makes him a good crisis manager? So we need senior people who have gone through a lot of crisis that will make him a good crisis manager. Or could you compensate for personal experiences with reading R.M. Boyne's books? I mean, that's the big question here. That's what we are discussing.
That's a false question. This is a false dilemma. No, thank you, Magnus. And this ties beautifully into the question I was going to ask, but we'll take Magnus's question, because I was going to ask him, what would you tell young people who might have a leadership ambition? But hey, why not take this angle on intuition? Because that's is really almost the same thing. Do you need to have it, or can you develop it, or do you have to read books? And I'm going from Jane around the table this way, and that'll finish up our panel. So Jane, please, do you have Any reflection on this interesting question?
So many, so I'm going to try to synthesize. So first, the short answer is yes. So intuition or your gut instinct is formed by your relationships. I thought that was a new issue that was brought up. It's your relationship to advisors, both how they perceive the type of information you want, and then how you package that information to them based on relationships. So I think intuition changes based on who's giving you information and the relationship you have with those individuals that are giving you information. And I do believe there are and will be, from the learning phase, as Professor Boyne has always said, right? The learning phase, a revisiting of the structures that exist in the background and no one sees, emergency management. And there is an opportunity to take all of this learning, and what I love about Professor Boyne's writing is it's very actionable and practical. And so coming out of this, updating those systems and direction, and then linking it, which I scribbled on a whiteboard on Wednesday, but linking it to those entities whose mandate is to set the conditions under which a leader's intuition will be impacted for the unknowable crisis of the future.
Well, thank you, Jane, for calling our work actionable, because I know Uri doesn't always think our work is actionable. And so Uri, I'll give you the microphone.
Well, let me first say, you know, getting to the closure of this session, that I would like to, you know, it's of course, when you ask about what is political intuition all about, okay, that's one question, and I will say something about it, but let me also say that I'm pleading actually for a better access on the part of genuine, we're talking crisis, creeping crisis here, of genuine crisis experts, crisis professionals, better access for that category of experts to the powers that be. And I wrote it down in my fifth item on my memo. Those are the kinds of experts who can say to a decision maker when he is just about taking the decision, well, sir or madam, take care, we have seen this before. Or do understand that I have in my inventory this or that concrete case where it went damned wrong because they then did this or that. And the guys and girls who can tell them on the basis of concrete empirical knowledge, this was very helpful then and there. Or please forget about that seemingly wonderful solution to the problem because it will not work. And they can tell them and hammer home the reason why that is so. And by the way, please pick up the best practices from over there. What I see in the COVID-19 crisis, and I've said it to some of our political leaders, and we discussed that yesterday, it was a part of the discussion here. Yes, we know often what is going on in other countries, and even better than in our country, but we are not capable, again, this mental frame, to really do something with these best practices from abroad or from others. That's one part. Now, with regard to political intuition, Jet said it already, take 10 political leaders, and they all differ in so many characteristics. What strikes me is that when we talk also about intuition and the significant detail, it is often about words which are spoken or words which are written down, and where the political leader with his kind of political intuition says, this doesn't fit in with my narrative, with my story. I don't like this. I don't want to hear this. You know, those kinds of communication between the people who are in his direct surroundings, that is what it is all about, I would say. And then we can conceptualize it into big things like the frames, the concepts which we are using, multiple crises taking other form, etc. But it's often simply about words which are spoken and where the politician says, this doesn't fit in with what I actually want to say, want to think about, want to act upon. I can't be more concrete than that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yet.
Yeah, I would say that political intuition is not something that simple is there or you can simple learn. I think it's more the effect of seeing the bigger picture and also to see the significant details at the same time. So it's part of experience. It's also part of having a conviction, having the ideas, as Uri said, the values that are most important for you. Because if you have to tell and to convince the general public about very difficult decisions to be made, then you have to believe it yourself. You have to relate it to your own values, your own conviction. Then combined, so it's conviction, it's see the bigger picture and significant details, that's experience, with what I would say humbleness or responsiveness, to show also that to be to show leadership, but also to know that you can't do it all alone. And finally, to use your advisors. And to use them in, also to appreciate them in their knowledge. Indeed, as Uri said, if they might reflect upon earlier experiences, but also as people in their own rights. Bureaucrats have to bring truth to power. And then it's very important in crisis that you listen carefully to them. So political intuition is a combination of having your own values, having experiences, be humble, and listening to your advisors.
Wonderful. Then, thank you. And so the final word then is, you know, what makes then in this context for a good advisor, Frederick?
Yeah, I think we share a lot of needs here, and I do think leaders, advisors, what we need to do is to test our abilities on a recurring basis in a way that allows us to see if we have a good instinct. Some people have horrible instinct, and you know, they probably shouldn't trust it. So I'm going to just say that we need to exercise more, and we need to exercise better. We usually train to win, so we always end up saving lives, winning the war. But we need to exercise the really tricky ones, when there are no wins to be had, just, you know, traps to escape more or less unscathed. And if we do that, I think we can also sort of hone our instincts and our judgments.
Well, thank you so much. I got the book title coming out of this one. It's called Intuition and the Significant Detail. So that'll be the book coming out of this. I want to thank Jane Swift in Massachusetts, Jet Bussemaker for joining us today, Uri Rosenthal and Frederick Bynander all the way from Stockholm. This was a wonderful panel. Thank you so much.